Thank you very much for joining today for this presentation by the Amistad Project of the Thomas More Society. I want to thank the Thomas More Society for their support. I'm Mark Serrano with Proactive Communications. Just a reminder, please, to exhibit social distancing, wear your masks as you move about the room. We are coming live to you today as well, live streaming, and we welcome everyone for their time, giving us their time today. You will see through our press release that we are providing our documents, our slides, and the report that we're announcing today at got-freedom.org, got-freedom.org. And we thank you for joining us for this very important announcement as we release a new report about the influence of Mark Zuckerberg's dark money network in the 2020 election. Leading our presentation today will be the director of the Amistad Project, Phil Klein.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. And thank all of you for attending. I appreciate your attendance today and coming out in this, I guess it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, which is kind of wonderful this time of year with the snow coming down. Again, my name is Phil Klein. I'm the director of the Amistad Project, and the 2020 general election witnessed an unprecedented and coordinated public-private partnership in swing states to improperly influence the election for Mr. Biden. This evidence that we're presenting today is present and available to all Americans so that they may see it and assess it, despite the effort of blue state governors and executive officials. The mainstream media has also tried to censor this evidence. Private interests and corporate oligarchs through social media have attempted to prevent the presentation of this evidence. Yet despite all of those efforts to prevent the American public from seeing the truth, America understands that there are serious problems with these elections, and its citizens are demanding that this not happen again, and that this investigation and the influence of private monies in this election through the purchase of local election officials and offices dictating how they manage the elections not ever happen again, and that we come to understand what occurred during this election. The report we are releasing today, entitled The Legitimacy and Effect of Private Funding in Federal and State Election Processes, was commissioned by the Amistad Project of the Thomas More Society and completed by Stillwater Technical Solutions, whose principal, James Carlson, is with me on the stage. James is a prolific author and writer, and he additionally has influenced public policy at the national level with the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, the United States Congress, and the White House. His team has been working on investigating the influence of private monies for some time now, and that report will be revealed to you today. The report details the flow of more than $500 million, more than the federal government expended in the CARES Act to fund the election during the COVID crisis, by over $100 million more than the federal appropriation. This effectively is a shadow government running our elections. $500 million into the hands of state and local officials who in turn allowed those private organizations and private interests to have access to sensitive and private information of American citizens that was of value to political parties and monetized for interests on the left. It also reveals how private parties, by dangling the dollar bill, incentivize local election officials to violate state law, radically alter election procedures, act contrary to federal law, and violate federal law under the Help America Vote Act. It involved a government in a scheme to turn out a specific demographic of voter. And government engaging in turning out a specific demographic of voter is the opposite side of the same coin as government engaging in an effort to suppress turnout among a specific demographic. Such is not allowed under United States law and is a violation of equal protection and a violation of a prime precept in American law that all citizens need to be treated equally. As a legislator, I often had occasion to speak with groups of individuals who would often give me this refrain: why don't you run government like a business? To which I replied, government's not designed to be a business. It has a much different objective than a business. Government must treat all citizens equally. That means there's inefficiencies in government. It is inefficient in an election to have more than one candidate. You know, we see efficiency in elections in the former Soviet Union when they had one candidate and the elections were run very swiftly and the results were known. That is not the role of government, to discriminate against certain persons and run the election efficient. It is to run it with fairness and transparency and access. And fairness and transparency and access are not the most efficient ways to count votes. It's much easier to let one person go in the room and determine the winner and come out and announce it than to actually allow America in the counting room. And instead, this time we ran government like a business, with $500 million of an oligarch's private monies dictating that America must be kicked out of the counting room, while the billionaire was allowed inside the counting room. This report and the evidence we're going to share today demonstrates that Mr. Zuckerberg's funds flowing through charities paid for the election judges, paid for the satellite offices to turn out the vote, paid for the machines, and dictated the policies that undermine state law. No. The real question we need to ask when we talk about the size of government is whether a specific function is part of government's role, or is it better done in the private sector? That's the real question. What is the scope of government's role? And government has the core responsibility of managing the elections. We don't put out elections for bid. We don't have elections brought to you by Coca-Cola. It is government's job to manage elections, and it must do so without a thumb on the scale and without private interests dictating how those elections are to be implemented. In other words, the question is not efficiency. The question is fairness. And the best antiseptic to a lack of fairness is transparency. Let me restate this because it is fundamental and an important point, or the very purpose of all of our election laws. The best protector of equality and fairness is transparency in the election process. Equality means counting every valid vote, and the flip side of the same coin of equality means not counting every invalid vote. You know, I'm reminded of when the United States first opened up the Oklahoma Territory for settlement. And at the time, a lot of people lined up on what was the border of Kansas, and they shot off a gun, and they allowed them to rush in. That's where we get Oklahoma Sooners, by the way. People cheated, rushed in early, and popped up and said, I claim this land, the Sooners. But people rushed in, and they formed towns overnight. One of the first towns that was formed had to elect a mayor, so they had people stand in line, 2 lines. If you support this candidate, stand in this line. If you support this candidate, stand in this line. And then they appointed somebody to count as people walked by. And what they learned was some people were sneaking back in the line to be counted twice. And that's when they elected their first sheriff to be able to manage that election. And the point being that with transparency, we can discover fraud. With boarded up windows and election officials kicking one party out, you can't discover fraud. And kicking a party out is a violation of election law. It is a direct violation of election law. And people don't violate the law without a reason. Now we have other means of transparency, and you might remember in our lifetime in the Bush-Gore battles, looking at the hanging chads, debating whether a dimpled chad was an actual vote. That was valid because that election was transparent and America was in the counting room. You didn't get that opportunity in this election. You weren't in there. Mark Zuckerberg was. Again, the truth is that America was kicked out of the counting room and a billionaire was allowed in. This billionaire, who gave over $500 million that we've been able to track and James has been able to identify in this election, poured most of that money through a charity entitled and named the Center for Tech and Civic Life. I will now call this Zuckerberg's charity because I believe that if you give $350 million to one charity, you have the right to call it after yourself. And as I mentioned, Zuckerberg paid for the election judges. He purchased the drop boxes contrary to state law. He ordered the consolidation of the counting facilities. Zuckerberg paid the local officials who boarded up the windows to the counting room. Zuckerberg money purchased the machines, Dominion and otherwise. And Zuckerberg money was contributed to secretaries of state like Michigan's Jocelyn Benson, who has fought transparency in this election by refusing to release computer logs and trying to bury forensic reports relating to those logs. That is not transparency. That is not the role of a Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's role is not to protect the vendor who manufactures the machines and distributes them. It's to forward the rights of Michiganders to a safe and fair election and a transparent election. Today, with this report and other evidence gathered by the Amistad Project, we're going to tell you this story. It is a story that should have already been told by the mainstream media. And I'm convinced, and if we can move the slide, I'm sorry. There we go. It's a story that should have been told by the mainstream media, and a story I'm convinced would have been told by the mainstream media if the billionaires had a different identity. If it was the Koch brothers, I don't believe that we would have to hold this news conference to reveal this truth. If it was the National Rifle Association putting in $500 million to purchase local election offices and incentivize officials to violate existing state law, we would not have to be holding this news conference. But because the mainstream media has a different agenda than the truth, we have to hold these news conferences and pray and hope that the American people will see past the censorship and the lies. There is no question whether there's evidence that dramatically impacted this election and incentivized people to violate election laws. That evidence has been demonstrated and it has been proven. We are obligated as Americans to share the truth when we uncover that truth. So if you can switch to the slides, please, I'm going to move this forward. As I mentioned, the American public can see through the fog and the smoke screen. Americans don't have confidence in this election. They know something was different. They know that the consolidated counting centers having work stoppages and the sudden flow of hundreds of thousands of ballots into one center radically altering the result is not normal. They know intuitively that putting hundreds of thousands of ballots in the drop box and not telling how those ballots got to the counting center breaks the chain of custody of the ballots and calls into question the legitimacy of the ballots. All of this knowledge has resulted in recently, if we can move the slide, this poll was given to us just yesterday. A Newsmax poll that shows that a majority of Americans believe that there was fraud in this election, despite the censorship. If you could move the slide, and you look at 9% are unsure. That means they have questions about the election. If you combine that with those who believe that there was fraud, that's 54% of Americans, contrasted with 45% of Americans. A majority of Americans believe there was fraud in this election. And let me tell you, to call into doubt this election, you don't have to prove fraud. That's a media concoction. You have to prove that election laws were violated. And that has been admitted to by officials. We can move the slide, please. This is how the mainstream media is reporting this evidence. Amid false claims of election fraud. Amid false claims, that is a pretense in the mainstream media before any report regarding the evidence, the admissions, the testimony of witnesses who say that there was fraud, say they participated in fraud, say they were trained to commit fraud, and election officials admitting they violated state election laws. Despite that, if we could go back to the screen, this precedes all reports. Admit false. That is a lie. That is a media lie. And Americans deserve better, and they demand that journalists live up to the proud heritage of their profession. I received a phone call from a reporter from the Wall Street Journal who asked me this question. He said, "Mr. Klein, how can you criticize the election process? You shouldn't criticize it. That undermines democracy." I laughed. The lifeblood of democracy is open discourse. The lifeblood of democracy is debate. The proud profession of a journalist is to criticize where government goes wrong. Every citizen in this nation has the right to stand up and proclaim criticism of its government. It is stunning to me that a member of the journalistic profession would say we shouldn't criticize the manner in which government conducted itself. That is stunning to me. Would we have ever uncovered Watergate? Would we have ever revealed the excesses of government in interning Japanese Americans? Would we have ever improved ourselves to the current condition where we recognize that not only men but women, as well as those with different skin color, have inherent and intrinsic rights to be protected by government without criticism of the government? That is frightening to me, this push towards cultural hegemony that asked us all to shut up because criticizing the process undermines the process. No, not in America, maybe in the former Soviet Union, maybe in totalitarian governments, maybe in those who want to hold on to power at all costs and don't want to reveal the truth. Maybe that criticism is valid from those persons. And what we see today is government managing itself in a way, unfortunately, that punishes criticism. I'll get to a little bit more of that in a little bit. If we can go back to the slides. The media. The media has had a false narrative all through this election to not, or to do everything possible to avoid looking at the truth, to avoid it. Let's talk about some evidence. To believe the media's portrayal that there is absolutely no evidence, I have to first explain the concept of evidence. If I showed up, as an investigator, and I oversaw the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and if I showed up at your home and I had a search warrant for documents that I believe revealed that you committed tax fraud, and it was a hot summer day and I'm outside your home and suddenly you board up the door, you don't allow us to come in, and I see smoke coming from the chimney, that's evidence. That's a pretty darn good conclusion that you're burning the documents so that the evidence will be destroyed. That is evidence, by the way. To believe what the media has to say, you have to believe that election officials confessing that they intentionally violated state law is not evidence of a problem in the elections. These admissions are found in every state. In Wisconsin, they admitted that they did not require identification on those who were indefinitely confined, and that they did not check if those persons who were indefinitely confined were actually indefinitely confined. Instead, they ordered election officials to accept the claim, contrary to state law. Drop boxes, contrary to state law in Georgia. Mobile ballot pickups without chain of custody, contrary to state law in Pennsylvania. The way that they cured ballots in Pennsylvania was contrary to state law. And courts have found this, by the way. They have found this to be true. Additionally, in Michigan, the manner in which they removed Republicans and the manner in which they cured ballots. And we'll speak about that more, and we'll get express details as it relates to these violations of law. So to believe the mainstream media, you have to believe that a confession is not evidence of what the person confessed to. You also have to believe, if we can go to the next slide, that a box is a human being. You have to believe that a box is a human being. Let me give you an example. I testified before the Wisconsin legislature recently, and I testified after Mr. Knutson, who's a Wisconsin election official. And he said, I know that the law says that we must deliver absentee ballots to the clerk, but what does that mean? What does clerk mean? Could it mean somebody that the clerk appointed? Or could it even mean a drop box? Now, you have to look to the purpose of the law. The purpose of the law is where the law lives and breathes, and the purpose is clear. Delivering an absentee ballot to a person rather than an inanimate object allows the person to verify the legitimacy of the absentee ballot. So, a person is not equal to a drop box. That is an admission of a willful and intentional evasion of the law. If I walked into this room and I had a gun, and I don't, by the way, and I pointed it at somebody's head and pulled the trigger, and I said, oops, I didn't know what a gun did, who amongst you would believe that I am innocent of shooting that person? A drop box is not a human being. It's not a clerk. It is an inanimate object without the ability to make sure that that ballot that is cast is one that is valid. To believe the mainstream media in this, and I've pocketed mine, you have to believe the next slide, please. Oh, here it is. You have to believe that the earth is the definition of place. Let me give you an example. Michigan law says that the place of the counting shall have present members of both major political parties. And remember that I said transparency is prophylactic to fraud. If you're not transparent, you can't prove the fraud. And what is happening in Michigan is the law allowed them to take ballots that could not be fed through the scanner because the paper, all military ballots were printed on the wrong paper in Michigan because somebody might have torn it or they had a coffee stain. And allows what's called election inspectors to look at that ballot and then fill out a new ballot for this person who's not there, cast it and count it. So they're casting votes for people who aren't there. That's why the law very wisely says both parties need to look at it to make sure it's done properly and sign off. And so what Michigan did in Wayne County is they formed a counting room. They consolidated it for the first time ever under Zuckerberg's plans. And they had 134 counting tables in a room the size of 2 football fields. And they said, we complied with the law. A Republican was in the place. He was in the cheap seats, or she was in the cheap seats, and they couldn't even see what was happening at the tables. To believe that's not evidence of fraud, you have to believe that when the legislature passed the law saying a Republican must be in the place, they actually meant any place on the planet Earth. Clearly, that's not the purpose of the law. Clearly, that is an intentional violation of the law. Oops. But it gets worse. Michigan is under siege. Michigan executive officials are now using the power of government to threaten those with whom they disagree with. Bringing this evidence forward not only gets you the mockery by the mainstream media who refuses to report it, it now gets ethics complaints filed against you if you're a lawyer, where you have the Attorney General, the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the state of Michigan, tweeting that those who bring these lawsuits need to be investigated ethically. Now, we've talked about the importance of a public discourse in a democracy. That doesn't allow public discourse. That is a chilling of public discourse. That is asking lawyers to put their fear above representing their clients in legitimate litigation. That is wrong. And I'm stunned that the Bar Association and other organizations of professionals in the legal community have not condemned this type of activity by the chief law enforcement officer in the state of Michigan. But it gets worse. The Michigan Attorney General threatened legislators with whom she disagreed with criminal prosecution. She tweeted it out and gave an interview that those legislators who might not agree with certifying the election could be investigated criminally by the chief law enforcement officer of the state of Michigan. Folks, that's totalitarianism. That is thuggery. It is stunning that America hasn't risen up with a uniform voice and state that when the state threatens people who are elected to be the voice of the people with criminal prosecution if they speak on the people's behalf, should be arrested. That's not the United States of America. Michigan is under siege. And it gets worse. In Michigan, the electors met on December 14th at the Capitol building as required by law. The governor and others said that COVID restrictions prevented people from being present, but it's interesting how COVID only blocked Republicans from entering the Capitol on that day. Democrats entered. They selected their electors on the Senate floor. Republicans were barred at the door. But if you believe that COVID was the reason, let me show you that it really wasn't, because, again, this is an admission. Governor Whitmer later said it wasn't COVID. If we can go to the next slide. She claimed, no, back one. It was a security threat. She first claimed COVID, but then later it was a security threat. And she gave an interview to NPR on that security threat. Interesting, what security threat would allow Democrats in the building and Republicans not to go in the building? I'm uncertain. But this is what happened. That is Ian Northam, an attorney in Michigan. He's surrounded by Republican legislators and electors who are being blocked by one of the 200 police officers that Governor of Michigan, Governor Whitmer mobilized to prevent them from coming in that building. The People's House was shuttered. It was closed. Governors don't dissolve parliaments or legislatures. Kings and queens do. That's not America. That's not the process. But later we learned, and we thank the Michigan police by revealing this truth. Afterwards, they say they're not aware of any threat that was given, that there was no credible threat. There was no basis for COVID. This was just a power grab that used the force of the state and the police power of the state to prevent Republicans from gathering on a day where they have the constitutional duty to review the election and to certify it, so that only a select group of people were allowed in those hallowed halls. Folks, that chamber is not Governor Whitmer's chamber. It is the people's chamber. And that Capitol should be open to the people of the state of Michigan. This is frightening. And I hope people start to wake up to this. We got involved in the Amistad Project almost 2 years ago. Concerns with election integrity, originally as it relates to the digital vulnerabilities of our elections. And we'll speak briefly about that a little bit later. But we started to see things change as we moved into the COVID concerns in the spring of 2020. And we saw governors starting to proclaim themselves to be not a part of the lawmaking process, but to be the law. And they said that they were exercising these emergency police powers for our benefit. Now, these powers, which are extraordinary, are only to be exercised at a time when democracy cannot function, when the legislature is in a bunker, or they're hiding, or they've been decimated by foreign attack. When democracy can function, we don't have a constitution that supports governors saying, I do not have faith in democracy. I'm not going to propose bills. I'm not going to have a public hearing. I'm not going to have debates about whether this is good for America. I'm going to dictate it. And what I believe that we're missing is that these dictates cover every aspect of human life. They cover whether you can be 5'11" away from a person or 6'1". They cover whether you can attend a funeral, whether you can attend a wedding, whether you can have friends over for the holidays, whether you can visit a loved one who is dying. And when you pass laws that impact every aspect of human life, those laws are unenforceable. There's no police force large enough to enforce those laws. So what happens? They're only enforced against those who raise their voice against the government. And that's what you see happening in America today. Health or workout areas where somebody says the government's wrong, suddenly they get raided. A barber in Michigan who says, wait a minute, I disagree with this, they get raided. You see government not only playing favorites in elections, playing favorites in who has economic vitality and whose business is going to be crushed. Big box stores are open, while church facilities of the same size cannot open. You have arbitrary enforcement. We got involved because Governor Whitmer herself threatened a group of black urban pastors with jail if they met to speak against cancel culture. We represented that group called One Nation. She continued to threaten them with jail if they met or if they marched, while she marched with Black Lives Matters. We see this example all across the nation, and it violates a basic tenet of American law that all citizens have value and all citizens are to be treated equally, and all voices have value in the American debate. We're trending the wrong direction out of fear. Fear has allowed them cover to become petty tyrants within their state. As we move through that process, we started to see the impact on elections as emergency orders started to change the election process. This is the report prepared by Stillwater. And it shows the flow of private monies on the top tier from leftist organizations through 8 private 501c3s, as well as 2 quasi-public private entities, demonstrating